My name is Jeff Ansley. I really get into some Oregon OA. And in fact, I was asked to share what I thought was the top 10 for Oregon OA. And I got a little bit into it because there are some other interesting pieces in Oregon that had to be mentioned. First off, before I get into the top 10, is two Codwell pins that have showed up in recent years. They've probably been around, but I'm not putting them in the top 10 because they're Codwell pins and everyone chases them. The first two lodges in Oregon, Chiskin and Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti, chartered in the 1944, 1945. And they came out with some Codwell pins. I think those are the two first issues OA-wise in Oregon. While I was talking to a person from Chiskin, the lodge chief, he thinks that the Codwell pin came out before their X1. In fact, he says their Codwell pin came out before their X1. So if he was the first lodge chief, then he ought to know. But they're interesting pieces. I know of three of the Chiskin ones and two of the Coast-na-se ones. Two of them are in Chiskin Lodge, and the other one's in Juan de Monte Lodge, the owner. So just some interesting pieces I ran across on my research. Now, this is one that I think Frank and I agreed on after I did some research. The Makwa 437 in 0.5. There's one in the Las Vegas Museum. Frank has it on his needs list. I have it on my needs list too, but it's that rare. I know of one. There was some dispute on whether it's a prototype or an actual neckerchief, but I would say that if whoever put it in the Vegas Museum, if they acquired one and looking at the quality of it, I don't think it was something that was personally made. So I would venture to say that that's probably the hardest issue in Oregon. Until that one came up, it was believed that this one's on Frank Kern's collection here, the highest chuck 442 in 5. This one was subject to some debate because some people thought it was a Camp Meriwether issue, but local Providence has established it as a highest chuck issue. This one was in the collection of Ed Holbrook, who was the ultimate authority on scout knives, verified by Doug Barris and Frank Kern. And I think also Tim Mayfield, who he doesn't really get online much, led his Providence to sitting there saying that this is the first neckerchief of highest chuck. My number 3 is the Chiskin X1. There are 3 or 4 of these issues known. The last one went for over 10 grand to Paul Kelly, but he owns one. Mike Johnson owns one, and there's a few others that are around, but this one went for 5 figures. Very hard to get on a lot of Oregon collectors' need list. Kind of very basic, but it's a tough one. Now I come to about the hardest flap in Oregon, in my opinion, which is the Makwa F1. You'll see them anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000. Somebody on eBay had it for $7,000. He's dropped it to just below $6,000 now. But I think it's the hardest flap in the state of Oregon, barring a few from 253. But I rank this one higher because it's the first flap. My number 5 is the Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti X1. I had my doubts about it, but I talked to a few people, and they convinced me that this one was definitely worthy of its ranking. There are some fakes known to be existing. Dana Bonstrom out of Kettle Falls, Washington, has verified that there's a few of these that have been faked that are floating around. But it's a nice piece. It is Coast-na-se's first piece, other than the Codwell pen. It's one of 2 Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti pieces that I need for my collection. They're available. The price is right. You can probably get it for about $1,000 to $1,500. My number 6 is the highest chuck in 1. I'm going to say this. Every steak and neckerchief in highest chuck is very difficult to get. This one is in a friend of mine's, Ethan Jones collection, but this is a picture of his. That leads to number 7, which is the highest chuck in 2. Again, this is from Ethan's collection, and highest chuck was sort of restricted under items. I think it was 1 per life, and they kept that restriction going up through the name change to Skylo. The Chiskin patch that I put, this one's tougher than the S1, the S3. I have not seen one except for one shirt, and it's that difficult. The members of Chiskin say this is their hardest flap in their lodge. They may have an S1, they may have an S2, but they don't have the S3. You can tell it because it's the cut edge with the vertical embroidery for the lake and the sky. It's a beautiful piece, but it's real tough to get a hold of. My number 9, I go with Makwa F2. Another tough piece, hard piece to get. That lodge was based on Klamath Falls, and it's 2 major cities for Klamath Falls and Bend, Oregon. And until recently, Bend was an obscure little hole in the wall on the east side of the Oregon Cascades, and Klamath Falls was the only claim to fame to it was the headwaters of the Klamath River, and it just was not en route to Crater Lake National Park. But neither city was huge, and the lodge was not huge. This one is sparks some debate by some people. This is a segment out of Oregon Trail Council and Chaiskin Lodge. For a while, I thought it was just a camp segment, but I talked to the powers to be, the historians in Chaiskin, and this is an actual Chaiskin issue. It's probably their second hardest X past their X1. Is darn difficult. I've seen one on a shirt in a display, and that was about a year ago. But I didn't even know this thing exists because every time I look at a box, I see Makwa and the Lakwa. I just say, oh, camp piece. Now I know better. Now I'm going to go into honorable mentions. I felt that these patches and pieces needed to be mentioned. I went with lodge order, some with pictures, some without picture. I needed to bring people's attention to these. First one is one that probably could challenge the Chaiskin X3 for importance, and that is the Chaiskin S7. It's their 25th anniversary flap. It's probably when people get that in Chaiskin, this is probably one of their last 5 or 6 pieces they need. A couple other ones you have right here is their S48 annual flap fundraiser, what their lodge calls a contrived rarity. They made 25 of these things about 10 years ago. It's a contrived rarity. It's a modern piece, strictly for fundraising, but it's worth mentioning because it's one of their more difficult Chaiskin pieces. And I also pictured 2 of the neckerchiefs. There's a couple of other neckerchiefs that Chaiskin has made. I mean, I'm not talking about the ones with the pie. I'm talking about their with the pie patch. I'm talking about silk screen issues, and this one's the Laybat, this one's the D-Bat, and both of these are ranking the Chaiskin top 10, and I would say the Oregon top 25, at least, but they're real hard to get. In fact, this one right here, the D-Bat one, other than the one in Mike Johnson's collection and the one in Chris Graves' collection, those are the only 2 I've seen. This is Mike Johnson's, piece right here. It's a beautiful piece, just very hard to come across. I'm going to go into Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti now. This is the S20, which was the conclave service flap. Some people say it was a contrived rarity, but when you make 50 of them and give them to people who are on the service corps of the conclave, it's not a contrived rarity. It's a difficult piece to come by. One time I had a chance to get one for $1,000, and the guy was high. There was 2 available, Paul Collette and a guy named Vince Bishop. Each bought it for $1,000 a piece. Then we had one show up in Harris auction a couple of years ago, and it went for $1,500. So I'm kind of kicking myself for not dropping the $1,000 to get that piece. Another hard piece out of Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti is some people take a look at there's a blue border, a red border, and a gold mylar border. And above you had the silver border, and then you have a green border. Well, the gold border, the yellow border, I'll call this yellow border, is probably out of the standard ones that they issued, the hardest of the standard 4 that they issued, other the conclave service flap. You can't touch them in this area for under $200. This one was listed as a Z for a while, but it was issued at their last closing banquet of the lodge, the 50th anniversary banquet, the closing banquet. I was lucky enough to attend because during college, I was also a member of Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti back in the days when you could belong to 17 different lodges at one time. So I was a member of Coast-na-se and Chaiskin and Skylo at that time. I got my invitation for this thing, brought my wife along, and we both got one of these flaps. My wife flipped hers for $500 a couple years ago, but it's extremely hard. It's not a fake issue. It's definitely issued by the lodge. It's their last official issue. You'll see another, quote, death flap from Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti that was issued by Skylo. It's issued just before this one. This one is the true death flap for Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti. Another very nice piece that has gained value and traction lately is the Coast-na-se N1, their first neckerchief. There's 2 variations on this one. I think this one's variation A. I had a chance to get this when I was a member of Coast-na-se in college for $15. I passed, ended up paying $200 to get one, 20 years later, and I've been offered $500 for mine, and I said nope. But occasionally these pop up, but I think the person who ends up getting them most of the time, because he lives in the Salem area, is Doug Burse. So tell Doug that it's on your wish list, and when he turns one up, he'll give you a call. A few others from Coast-na-se-lav-a-ti that are pretty good is the 25th anniversary one, which came down in value recently because of a few more have turned up. The S18 Vigil flap, which is the green border of the Laybat flap that I showed above, and then the S2. The S2 S2 is interesting because it was a very small run in between the S1 and S3. The key feature of the S2 versus the S3 is this little thing right here, the shoulder blade right there. This, if it doesn't have a shoulder blade, it's an S3. If it has this little thing in it that I'm circling, it's an S2. I'll come to the next lodge on our list, Mazama. I consider their S3 one of their tougher flaps, cloth flaps, that they have. I've seen more S1s around than S3s. The R1, people in that lodge put this up there. I had 4 of these in a stack at one time, but I have one now. But a lot of people say that the R1 is a lot tougher. They said I may have gotten lucky when I had the 4 because I trained for them when I was a youth. Last but not least, I'm showing one of the 5 different pinky flaps that were made. These are authorized by the lodge, and they were all beaded flaps, mainly for either NOACs or for national jamborees. Very intricately detailed. There's a thing on the back that says handmade by Pinky, Blade, Stewart, but I just say Pinky, authorized by the lodge. Actually, those things have been gaining in value lately. In fact, I put a $150 bid on one and got stomped. I'll go with Makwa. Makwa, any jacket patch and any pie patch is usually worth having. Now, there was a rumor Dana thought he'd seen a dance team jacket patch. He now believes that it was probably a silk screening on the jacket because he says he's talked to several old-time Makwa people, and they kind of gave him a puzzled look like there was no jacket patch, leading to believe that was probably the dance team jacket that several lodges used to silk screen jackets for use by dance teams and ceremonies teams. Chenille 1, this was the first chenille officially issued by an Oregon lodge. You have the Skylu YC one, but that wasn't officially issued. Makwa issued the first chenille in Oregon for a lodge. Also, their 75th anniversary piece. This is on the upper end of what Makwa pieces are. This piece right here, the S225th, had to drop a couple hundred to get mine in pristine mint. That's a picture of mine. And then something that I seen on eBay, I didn't know this thing existed, but Makwa issued a 25th anniversary neckerchief slide. Kind of neat. Got a hold of somebody down there, and they got back to me and said, yes, it is a Makwa issue, something that's on my radar now. I'm going to come to highest chuck. As I said, all 3 neckerchiefs are damn hard. The next hardest piece in highest chuck is the F2. The F2 was issued had 1 loom run. Most of them got out to the Jamboree in 1960. If they got traded outside of the lodge. There's just not that many of them. I've seen a couple on shirts by the old timers. They do it just to irritate the young folk, but there are less of these than the F1. The F1's probably got a higher demand because it's a first flap, but this is the better flap, the best flap on a highest chuck. This was my holy grail for a long time. If anybody remembers Ed Harris, I got Ed Harris's, and his was crispy mint, and it's now in my collection. I'm going to get to Skylu. Now, Skylu has some restricted patch issues, not the S1 and not the S4, but they had some issues in the early 80s that there was 1 loom run of, and then they ordered another room run of. I didn't even realize there was a big difference until the Region 11 OA insignia guide came out. Frank put out back in the late 80s, early 90s. I didn't realize there was more than what I had, and I discovered that I was missing 2. I'm still missing 1 or 2 of them. You just don't see them because a lot of them got sewn on shirts. And the 2 regular neckerchiefs at Skylu, not the ones with the pie, but these are silkscreen, are difficult as well. This one was issued in 1986 or 87. This one was issued in 1987 to Ordeal Visors and the Ordeal Master. A lot of people didn't even know this one existed. Kevin Ruddisell seen it in my book, and he says, what's that? And I said, oh, that was the Ordeal Visor neckerchief from 1987. And he goes, how you have one? I said, I was an Ordeal Advisor. And he goes, how many were made? I said, probably 10 to 20, issued by the lodge, given to the Ordeal Visor and the Ordeal Master for the Ordeals that year. I know of 2 others that have surfaced, and they're both in collections. Here's one that Frank mentioned to me that he said was a lot harder than people give it credit for. It took me a while to come across one, but I finally got one, and it cost me 3 figures, but it was the covered wagon chapter neckerchief out of Skylu Lodge. There's another chapter neckerchief that has that's called Nicomas, but it pretty much has a Nicomas chapter patch sewn onto a black piece of cloth. I don't have the J4 pictured, but I have the J5. The J5 is probably the hardest jacket patch in the Portland-Salem area. It goes for over $1,000. And what differs this from a normal ceremonies jacket patch is that it says honorary on the bottom of it. And that was given to to team coaches and chapter advisors. There were about 50 of them made. They pop up about once every 10 years. Last one I've seen went for $1,750. Other S15 was this gold Mylar border 35th anniversary with the 442, not the 422. S25 is the LOTC patch. It has a red border. It says LOTC on it. S33, which is this gray border one here that they only made about 30 of. I'm going to get into Juan de Monte. Juan de Monte has produced a heck of a lot of patches since being created in 1994. I'm missing a few of the pieces because of the conspiracy to withhold them from patch collectors back in the 90s by the lodge advisor and his wife. This is the summer camp ceremonials patch, which was the staff advisor wanting to make a flap for kids who did ceremonies at summer camp. And I argued them against it because I said, they're already getting a camp staff flap. Why do they need a flap saying they did ceremonies? But I lost. The lodge voted for it. I go, oh, it's a youth run lodge. The culinary team patch, crew patch, the cooks got permission from the lodge to make this one. You have to serve on the cook staff 3 times to get one. This is the gold border Scouts BSA inaugural flap. There's a silver border that you'll see on eBay that ranges from $5 to $10. This one was sold by the lodge for $50, and they were numbered on the back. There's still some available. This one is the yellow border OA Trek from 1994. This one was made behind the lodge's back, but subsequently approved. But they gave the approval to make 3 flaps to the OA Trek crew going back there, and they made a 4th flap, which was this one, and got approval from the lodge basically at NOAC 94, because that's when we all discovered. They said, hey, when did this thing come out? Another piece that I haven't mentioned here is the X2 from Juan de Monte, which is a little hexagon shaped thing that went over the Skyloo portion of this patch right here that they could sew it over to convert it to a Juan de Monte patch. I have one, but nobody knows where the extras went. This lodge, Lola Kibula, is the king of contrived rarities in the Pacific Northwest. They had a lodge advisor who believed that it was his sworn duty to make patches very difficult for others to get in his lodge. Turned off a lot of people from collecting Lola. They got a new advisor now that has a head screwed on straight. They made a lot of contrived rarities. One of such is the X5. There's only 10 of these delegate chevrons. They have a whole bunch of these different scout shop design things to say you're a lingobat or a lingo hat or ceremonies team on them, but they made them in about batches of 25. They had some mini flaps for really nice, but they use those for fellowships and stuff, but they're pretty nice. They make about a couple hundred of each of those. Then there's 2 necklaces. I knew of one, which was the 2015. Then they came out and made another one around 2018. And putting this presentation together, I had some help with this. I want to thank some people. There are 3 books that are out right now. My contact information, if you want to get a hold of me. I do have this right here, 253 and 491, and I have my rough draft of 442. I do have those available to be emailed, or I can put them on a zip drive. I just ask if, have you make a donation to the 3 lodges, because that's where the funds are going.
I'd like to throw out a comment, Jeff. This is a very good list, and I want to give a little bit more information about the 437 flaps that you had on there. I was a Region 11 editor for Arapahoe back in the day throughout the 80s until its final edition, and as also the Region 11 editor for the first Blue Books. And the 437 F1 has always been one of the most coveted items locally. It's also one of the best first flaps nationally. But what a lot of people may not be aware of is back in the 80s, these things were so scarce, people didn't realize there was an F1 and F2. They were aware that there was a cut edge, but most people did not know there were 2. And the original editions of Arapahoe only listed 1 cut edge. It was Dana Bonstrom who came to a W1A conclave, and we were talking about tough stuff, and he said, well, do you have both cut edge Makwalas? And everybody's jaw dropped and said, what do you mean both? And so half the people were very, very happy because they had the scarce true first flap, and the other half were really, really mad because what they thought was the first flap became an F2, and it went being from a couple grand to a half a grand. So, had a split audience there. But regardless, both of them are just absolutely killer issues, even though the F2 doesn't bring the premium price.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Frank made me aware of, was that the F2 needed a lot more respect than it was getting.
The other thing, too, are those highest chuck neckerchiefs. I didn't get my first highest chuck neckerchief until like 2005, and I started collecting in 1980. And I always found them very difficult. And I only had one of each of them for the longest time, and I was able to find a second of, I can't remember if it was an N2 or the N1. But, considering the tenure I have in the collecting area and the number of collections I purchased and the number of quality dupes I've had, it just kind of stands to show how difficult those neckerchiefs are, because I've never had more than two of anything there.